Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Excellent. All right, we'll dive right in. So yes, thanks to Gemalto for inviting us to speak on this topic. It's definitely an important one in the landscape of how successful NFV and SDN applications are going to be in getting out into the marketplace. We've certainly had our fair share of experience over the last couple of years working with both our partner ecosystem as well as the service providers themselves, kind of bumping into all of these challenges and trying to work our way through it. So, you know, in some cases we'll be highlighting where the challenges are. In some cases we'll certainly offer some feedback on things that we're doing to address some of the challenges. But it's definitely a broader ecosystem task to take up in terms of addressing the kind of the business side of SDN to make it successful. So make sure I'm in the right window here. Without any further ado, I will jump in. Wanted to start real quick. Yes, as was mentioned, I work for a division called Ensemble. And so just to explain a little bit about what that is and some background on ADVA in general. In 2016, ADVA acquired a small company called Overture Networks, who, among other things, had a specific focus on building software solutions for NFV and SDN applications. Interestingly enough, Overture was actually part of the very first Etsy POC in NFV and SDN, so we've been dabbling in this for quite a long time since the beginning and are as excited as anybody to see it really start to take off en masse. But specifically after the acquisition, one of the things that ADVA did was set up the NFV portfolio as a standalone business unit called Ensemble. So Ensemble was the brand name for the Overture product line, and then it turned into the name of our business unit. And the primary focus of the Ensemble BU within ADVA is to really become a leading developer of cloud-based communications infrastructure, as it says on the slide here. Now, as a standalone BU within ADVA, it's really nice because we enjoy some of the flexibility of a smaller company. I mean, we're about 150 employees, very heavily engineering focused, but we're really a bit self-contained and a little bit self-deterministic in terms of driving our roadmap, being very highly agile and strictly focusing on delivering software applications. So sitting within a broader hardware company like ADVA, it's actually, you know, kind of a nice spot to be in terms of, you know, really focusing on the software side of this this opportunity. On the flip side, though, we do get to take advantage of some of the stability and the benefits of being inside a larger organization. So, you know, we have the sales reach of the broader ADVA. We can tap into the broader customer base, can take advantage of the global services network capabilities that ADVA brings. So it's, you know, it's a standalone business unit that fits within a broader entity that I think gives us a little bit best of both worlds. So that is what Ensemble is within ADVA, and we'll jump right into kind of the meat of the conversation now. I think for most of you on this call probably have some familiarity with what's going on in the NFV and SDN world. And I think it's safe to say that NFV represents a significant evolution, not only in how networks are architected and deployed, but also how they can be monetized. And I think to have an appreciation of the business side impacts introduced by NFV, it's really important to establish some level of context for how things were done in the legacy world. So, you know, this is not a, you know, an aha gee whiz moment, but it's really just setting the context for why is NFV so different when it comes to actually managing licensing, pricing, the whole monetization and business aspect of it. So when we look in the kind of the legacy world, quote unquote, you know, network functions such as things like, you know, call control elements, session control elements, routers, core routers, policy management, or even on the edge, you know, firewalls, you know, IP PBXs, those kinds of things. They were all delivered, and to many extents still are today, delivered as monolithic applications, where the function is embedded as part of the hardware platform, kind of as shown here on this physical network function image on the left-hand side of the screen. So if we build this out and take, for an example, a core network function that provides key capabilities such as, say, storage, you know, obviously platform infrastructure capabilities, application logic, or even things like traffic processing, you know, each of these functions is typically going to be delivered on a specialized hardware platform that's tailored to meet the specific requirements of what that function has to do. And so, when you look at then having to potentially grow the system or evolve the system, when you need to do more application processing or add more application features, you may have to add another blade to your server rack. If I have to be able to process more traffic or handle more interfaces, I'm going to add another interface module to my system. And again, each one of those components is going to contain all of the requisite hardware and software functionality to deliver that capability. So when I license applications or application growth, that license is tied to a physical box. You can't take that license and carry it and put it on another box. It's all embedded. It's very self-contained. So in that case, license management is a relatively bound and well understood problem. Now, pricing strategy is a different thing, but certainly license management, entitlement enforcement, those types of things is a much more deterministic problem. Same thing on an edge, right? So that was an example of a larger physical core network function. But when we look at the edge, very similar things happen. If I need to deploy multiple functions, some kind of access, a firewall, router, different kinds of features, again, each of those is typically embedded as a separate proprietary appliance that has functionality, hardware, everything all rolled into one. So interesting. Now, what does NFV do to this whole equation, right? So when we look at these network functions that were once delivered on single vendor kind of hardware appliances, and now they can be delivered as multi-vendor software applications. So I click here, and then on this common blue box, this typically a COTS server, I can now run multiple functions such as a router, a firewall, some kind of WAN optimization, a core network function can all be run on particularly a common type of hardware platform. Then I really am dealing with managing the licensing and entitlement of those software components that could be run anywhere, and they could be taken and put on different boxes. They can be moved around by the service provider. They can also be moved around automatically through the automated management control infrastructure that NFV defines as well. I also have the ability where I can scale or change functions, bring in new services, or potentially swap out a vendor's function within a given service and do that all dynamically. And so that's all done independent of the hardware. And so when you really decouple hardware and software from a functional perspective, you also have to decouple that from a licensing, a pricing, and an entitlement enforcement perspective. So the resulting solution here is that software licensing strategies from pricing and entitlement play a really important role in realizing what are the actual benefits that are envisioned by the deployment of virtualization. So that's why this is important. So moving on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what some of these benefits are. And again, for those of you that are familiar with NFV, this will be very well understood things. But again, in terms of context setting, it's important that we're all on the same page around what are the anticipated business benefits from deploying network virtualization. So one of the first things that everybody talks about is CapEx. So you can't go anywhere and listen to NFV being discussed without hearing about the CapEx benefits. And so, they are real. They are real. Excuse me, let me clarify. But there are certain things that have to be done to unlock the CapEx benefits that are afforded by NFV. Now, again, one of the key capabilities that are delivered through virtualization is the enablement of delivery of multiple network functions on a common hardware platform, like we showed in the previous graphic. So NFV allows, service providers to look at the actual physical environment, the device, almost as a commodity enablement component, and then therefore negotiate pricing of the physical infrastructure as a commodity, because I can buy one type of hardware platform and run multiple things. So, the buying power, the whole chain of development through the ODMs of building platforms that can be sold for multiple end purposes, really changes the economics of the hardware piece of this. And that's all done separate and independent from the rest of the service enablement technology, like the virtualization environment, the actual software functions, the management infrastructure, and such. And we're really seeing this effect kind of start to take hold now. When we look at things going on in the environment, we're seeing a push toward technology such as CORD. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what CORD is, that stands for Central Office or CO, reimagined as a data center, where the intent long term is for telcos to deploy their central offices or points of presence in a manner similar to what you would see in a Google or Amazon data center. So big data centers, rows and rows of racked and stacked, exactly the same kind of server that can be used for anything, and they're really, really cheap. Those boxes are really inexpensive, but I can put any kind of thing on those boxes and deploy services to my end customers. So that changes the commercial paradigm on the hardware side for sure. We're also seeing a similar push, when you're looking at edge-based services or access-based services and the rise of popularity of this thing called universal CPE. So same concept, smaller form factor, commercial off-the-shelf server infrastructure. Also, in general, we're seeing a strong push on the appliance side to move to cheaper commodity hardware platforms, so things such as Intel's Deverton hardware chipset, ARM-based systems, those kinds of things. White box switching as well are all important enabling technologies from a hardware perspective that, in effect, lower the cost per unit of a device that gets deployed in a rack unit in a data center somewhere. So that's really kind of one of the key things that CapEx brings. Now, when we talk about operational improvements, that's obviously kind of the other main area that everybody talks about when we talk about NFV. And so from an operations perspective, we really expect NFV to deliver significant efficiencies in how services are defined, how are they deployed, how are they managed. So when I can optimize my resources, my physical resources across multiple services or multiple segments, and not have to touch a lot of physical gear in different locations to deploy new services, there's an operational benefit to that. Because I'm deploying on common hardware infrastructure, the skill sets of my personnel that need to manage these boxes changes. Instead of having to have people that are familiar with a lot of proprietary hardware platforms and operating systems, they can all learn one physical environment and then really just have to deal with the functions on top of that. Because software can be remotely deployed and provisioned and managed through things like orchestration, I reduce the amount of physical touch point in terms of having a technician on site to deploy something, to modify something, to fix something, because that really starts to roll into the automated management aspect of that. So those are key things that can reduce operational expenses as well. There's other kind of tangential benefits as well, environmental, so, power, cooling, those kinds of things in a data center are a non-trivial part of the cost to run the business. And so when I'm leveraging, cheaper, more efficient commodity hardware platforms, there's kind of a requisite benefit on the environmental side as well from an operational perspective. So again, another key benefit. But then when we go beyond, those main ones, and we start to look at things like innovation and agility. So as I said, if NFV and SDN affords the ability to more simply define services, I can do it at a much more granular layer. I have the ability to create new services more simplistically through my automated management and tool sets. Then I can start to kind of fall into more of the OTT or internet kind of paradigm where I can go through this quote-unquote fast-fail model where I can define a service more quickly. I can target my service introduction because it can be deployed on any hardware platform anywhere in my network. I can say build a service and target to a particular customer segment, a particular enterprise, a particular geography, and then try that service out. And if it takes off, great. I can deploy it across my entire network and off we go. If it doesn't work, then great. I fail it, I take it apart, and I go create a new service. But because I can build these services more quickly, because I can target how they're deployed and managed, that ultimately reduces the time to market of deploying these new services and eventually gives me the ability to drive new incremental revenue because I'm coming up with more options for my end customers. So that's another nice kind of side benefit. And then we get into some of the quote-unquote other areas, the soft benefits that we can expect from NFV. And again, because I can deploy more services, I can provide more options, I can do it more quickly. So I can theoretically deploy with higher quality, and I can deploy a service more quickly as opposed to taking months. I can define a service and deploy it in days, hours, or minutes. The net benefit to that is that my customers are going to be happier. I'm going to have improved quality of experience. And because of the automated, flexible nature of NFV, again, theoretically, I have the ability to improve network and service availability and reliability because I have automated, fault remediation capabilities. I can re-instantiate or move service chains to other areas or other hardware platforms if there are issues in my network. Now, again, these are long-term goals, and these are all not day one types of goals. But this is really what virtualization is supposed to bring to the table. And so at the end, when you tie all this stuff together, really the goal for the service provider is to leverage the technology to improve revenue, cost efficiencies, time to deploy, availability, mean time to repair. These are all key metrics that we would expect to improve over time. So, when we go to this next slide, sounds great, right? Everybody's been hearing about NFV for a long time. Technologically, it's a nice utopian vision. So why are we not seeing NFV deployed en masse everywhere all the time? And the answer to that is, there's a couple answers, but for the purposes of this webinar, one of the key things is that there are still very real business challenges out there that need to be solved. So, you can have all the great technology in the world, but if it doesn't make sense from a business perspective, service providers still aren't going to deploy it. So we got a couple of data points here that I pulled out, and there's lots and lots of them, but here's 4 specific examples that we saw. So, and BT is not the only one that said this particular thing, but I actually had a quote from them that I saw, in the last several months, and that is that despite all the progress that we've made as a vendor community to demonstrate the technology, to show that it's viable from an NFV and SDN perspective, they still have the problem that legacy licensing and commercial models are holding the industry back. So, up until this point, we've seen a lot of VNF licensing models that really, replace on a like-for-like basis from a pricing perspective what they're charging for a physical appliance, which makes no sense. If I have to charge the same amount for software that I got historically with software and hardware, but yet in an NFV world I still have to stick a COTS box underneath it, NFV ultimately becomes more expensive. That's not what we're trying to achieve with virtualization. They're still seeing a definitive lack of competitive and flexible pricing models out there, and additional kind of side benefits of doing things like license pooling, license reuse, those kinds of things are still specific challenges that are being seen in the market. Management of licenses is very complex in a virtual world, and I have a slide here in a couple of slides that I'm ending with that kind of show what that means. Also tracking license expiration. If I have a service chain where I deploy it in month 1, and then in month 6 I take one of the functions and swap it out from vendor A to vendor B in that same service chain, now I've got a service license or a service business model that has a component which has a completely new license start point, right? A different expiration. And so, the complexity and granularity of NFV really, introduces some complexity as compared to the legacy model where it's all tied to a physical box. Netcracker, another from a vendor perspective, has certainly made comments around this that says, virtualization necessitates a different strategy for license management. So how do I allow my license management to support the scaling capabilities that are inherent to NFV, scaling up, scaling down, moving virtual functions from one platform to another? How do I ensure that the expiration of a license doesn't actually shut down the entire service? So I've got multiple virtual functions that make up an end-to-end service, and if one function has a licensing issue, we don't want that to take down the entire service. And coming up with a standard licensing model. There really is no standard licensing model or concept to manage multiple vendor licensing models across an end-to-end service. So that is certainly an area of complexity, which dovetails into the next one, which is kind of feedback from Etsy. Now, Etsy is starting to take up the banner for NFV licensing with a specific group focused on this issue. But their kind of view of the world is that, virtualization really implies a complex ecosystem with multiple actors that's going to require, not only some harmonization between the vendor community, but also potentially an evolution of the business practices of the service provider themselves. So, again, taking some of these new licensing and innovative licensing models when they come out from the vendor community, how does that impact their business and their pricing to their end customers? And then certainly the technical requirements, in there to come up with a common view of the world. The last one is from an industry analyst, Tom Knoll, who I think his comment speaks for itself, and that is that, while NFV is technically feasible, the implementation of NFV is not inevitable. And for the longest time, I thought that it was. And to some extent, I agree with them. I still think that NFV will absolutely happen. But we shouldn't bank on the inevitability of NFV in the carrier space, and really focus on the fact that to sustain the broad deployment, it has to be a win-win for both vendors and service providers. The vendors can't make no money, and the service provider, win, because the vendors will go out of business. The vendors can't make all the money and not provide a valid business model to the service providers, or they'll never move off the present mode of operation. So, it is very complex. All those benefits that we talked about in the first 10 minutes are certainly tempered by the fact that there are real business challenges that need to be solved. So, when we get into this concept of licensing and how does that play a part in solving this problem, we look at a number of different options that are out there, and I believe that we'll continue to expound on that in the second half of this presentation. But from an ADVA perspective, we're seeing a lot of variations on the theme that really boil down into two primary models that we're talking about with customers, and that is perpetual licensing versus subscription licensing. So when we use these terms, what do we mean? What's rolled up into this? So a perpetual licensing model provides, as it says here, an irrevocable, non-transferable right to use a software feature, typically at a certain release level. So you're going to pay me, and then you own the right to use that software at that certain level of capability forever and ever. Okay, now if you exceed the growth dimension or some capacity variable of that software license and you need to upgrade, then you're going to pay the difference from feature A level 1 to feature A level 2 to get out to that higher level of capability performance, whatever the growth variable is. Now, from that perspective, when I'm licensing software, I'm only licensing software. Services and support are typically going to be purchased separately and paid for up front at the beginning of the support time period. And those fees are usually paid for and are invoiced and paid up up front at the time of purchase. So from a service provider perspective, if I'm buying a perpetual license, I'm paying all the money up front before I have any customers actually using the service. So the burden of risk is solely on the service provider's shoulders. Now, when we look at options within the perpetual licensing model, vendors have the way of reducing some of the payment of the upfront costs through using techniques such as like pay-as-you-grow concepts. This is something that ADVA is definitely doing as well, where the software pricing may be more heavily weighted toward growth parameters rather than an upfront quote-unquote platform charge. And an example of that would be, say, if I'm selling some kind of management function software, I could put the lion's share of the price on, say, a price per managed element variable as opposed to an upfront 6 or 7 figure upfront charge, where when the service provider is only managing a couple hundred or a couple of thousand endpoints, they're only paying for what they're managing. But as their network grows and as they are more successful and they manage more, then the vendor would get more payment as well. So again, there's certainly different ways of coming up with pricing strategies within the licensing model to help offset some of the capabilities. But this is one of the key things from a perpetual license perspective. When we look at subscription, then subscription as compared is going to be revocable, but similar access to a license as long as the subscription payments are kept current. And when you exceed a capacity limit of a particular license or feature level, you just need to move to the next one, because I'm basically paying for it as I go along, right, on a monthly basis, quarterly basis. So if I'm using feature A level 1 and then we move to feature A level 2, then I'm just going to pay that new price on my next monthly interval. In a subscription model, prices are typically inclusive of services and support. So it is a one price, all bundled in, everything in there that's going to be paid monthly or quarterly. Again, typically you can come up with different models or variations within this. So what's the benefit of this? It's usually going to provide a lower entry price for the service provider, but over time, over the duration of the term, it may cost more. And I have a quick table in here that'll show that. But that gives you the ability to define flexible subscription terms. So I can do a 1-year, 2-year, 3-year, 5-year subscription term with renewal options, automatic renewal or renegotiation. It gives you a lot more flexibility. But we've also certainly seen service providers want to talk about options to cap. So I may do a 2-year subscription term that renews, and then over time, after I've been paying the subscription for 3 or 4 years, I don't want to pay the monthly fees anymore. I'd like to have a buyout where I can convert the license to perpetual and not have to pay any more recurring charges. So, those options all fit within a subscription. And when we look at, what does that look like? So just take this first line, for example. If I'm buying a perpetual license and I have to pay $40 for it, just as an argument, but I want to do a subscription price over different terms, I may pay, $1.85, $1.63, $1.48 on a monthly basis, depending on what my commitment term is. So the longer the term I commit, the less price per month, the less price per year I'm having to pay as a service provider. But if I commit to the 3-year term, at the end of the day, I'm going to pay more in 3 years than I would if I paid up front. So in this case, the burden of risk shifts more, a little bit toward the vendor side. Again, how you structure this, you can kind of balance that out. And there's obviously things like termination penalties and things like that that all go into this. But that's really how these different models play out in terms of actual financials and, for the end customer. And you kind of have to really balance that out with what you're delivering, what the customer's needs are in the end business case. But it's a very much collaborative engagement with the service provider at that point. So then my last slide, because I am running long, is really then around the whole concept of talking about automation. So how do we automate the process of ordering, fulfillment, and management of licenses between a service provider and a software vendor? Because at the end of the day, even with the best licensing model, the best pricing strategy in the world, this process is still going to be really painful if there isn't a way to automate the management of software licensing and entitlements. So this figure really shows kind of a high-level view, a representative workflow of something that ADVA has been working on with some of our customers to date. This is still a work in progress, and obviously implies a bit of an intricate dance with each of the service providers. Again, as we mentioned in that challenges slide, there are a lot of challenges, and that require a lot of hard work to work through. So I'll quickly walk through kind of what this means and some of the key points, but certainly from a customer perspective, we need to provide them a way to automate, or at least kick off an automated process of ordering licenses, and those are actually done in forms of entitlement to start with. So I can do a bulk order, I can set up some kind of automated EDI exchange, with our business operations software platform, but they're going to put in essentially an order for software licenses, which is going to go into our licensing infrastructure, and is going to create entitlements for that end customer. And then we're going to be able to deliver those entitlements to the customer license management server. Now, we work in different cases where the customer owns this license management server. It's something they want to build and tie into their back-end BSS platforms, I should say. There are cases where we work with third-party partners where we can put a license server in a customer network as well that does the actual management of the entitlements and distribution of the license files. So there's different ways that this can be implemented, but you're going to essentially deliver a list of entitlements to the customer, and then when they go to deploy an individual function or a box or a set of functions, then they're going to come back and then say, okay, I want to use one of these entitlements now. Here's a particular node I'm going to deploy. Generate a license file for me, and they're going to interact automatically with our customer portal, where we're going to tie that entitlement to a node and then generate a node lock license file that gets passed back to their server and then ultimately pushed down, typically as part of a zero-touch commissioning process, to the platform. So in this case then, this software is instrumented in such a way that it knows that it needs a license file to become active. Now I'll talk about some variations on that theme in a second, but ultimately when I'm up and running then, and the platform, the virtual functions, all of them are going to be licensed and operational. Now say we get into a situation where they're selling this to a particular enterprise customer, and that customer decides to change service, so I need to retire that service. I have to have the ability to return that license, or really the entitlement, back to the server so I can reuse that. They bought it, they own it, if it's not a subscription model, for example, and then they may need to repurpose that license for another customer. So there has to be that mechanism as well. The infrastructure also has to have the ability that when we generate an actual file to be turned up in the network, that's when we auto-create an invoice to charge them for the use of that feature. And so that all has to be automated as well. There also has to be a tie in between the license management server and the customer network that says, hey, I'm depleting my license pool. I need to be able to order more and kick off that process as a kind of a closed-loop process. So this is a very high-level view of kind of how you can do this automation. But again, there's a lot of work involved in here. And one of the other key things that I wanted to mention as I wrap up is that to deal with some of the other objections around this, the software has to be smart enough that, it can be deployed in the network, say, in a trial period mode where it's fully functional, but can operate without having a valid entitlement for some period of time, or, sorry, a valid license file for some period of time. So, you don't delay the service activation. You can truly automate the instantiation of the service. And if the license expires, it doesn't automatically shut down immediately the function. It may run unlicensed for a certain period of time where it's generating alarms and feedback both to the customer and to the vendor stating that it's now running in unlicensed mode. So, there has to be some intelligence built into the functions themselves where you have enforcement, but you're not super strict enforcement that, in the first minor glitch, you take the whole entire customer service down. And we've seen some of those cases where that's happened in the real world. And so, again, there's lots of considerations both in terms of infrastructure, integration with the carrier, actual implementation logic on the functions themselves around how all this needs to be managed. So, again, big picture around what virtualization brings to the table, obviously some of the benefits and challenges, and then some of the things that ADVA is doing both in terms of our licensing strategy and automation and enforcement strategy from a product perspective. So with that, I know I'm running long. I'll stop here, and either we can take questions or move into the next phase and then take them at the end. I'll leave that up to you guys.
No, thank you, Michael. I'll let Jana ask you one question, and then I may let Darim jump in to do his session, and then you can get a chance to read some of the questions that came up so that you're ready to answer them towards the end. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so maybe Jana, you can just come in with your question.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. I saw you mentioned ITSI and Netcrackers. I'm looking very carefully at what's happening in terms of ITSI, and I do know that they're undertaking a new study on license management in an NFV World. So what's happening in this study is mainly pushed by communication service providers in order to ease their life while dealing with multiple VNF providers. And the fundamental issue that is discussed there is basically VNF providers to trust third-party tools like management and orchestration software companies to do actually enforcement on their behalf. So I would like to understand what do you think about this? What is your view on that? Would you be willing to trust third parties to control your licensing and let them do enforcement on your behalf?
So I think that's obviously a complicated question. I think the short answer is that yes, to some degree. I think that it's going to be required of the vendor community to distribute the end-to-end management of licensing and license enforcement to third parties. Now, again, the workflow that I showed, we're actually working on this with some of our customers, and yes, in some respects, the actual license server that sits in their network is not an ADVA controlled product. So, I think as a vendor, the enforcement at the product level still needs to be there so that, as a software vendor, I don't want someone to have a copy of my software and they can go run it on any box and have full functionality forever and ever. I mean, that would, be complete erosion of my business. So the software has to have some intelligence that it won't run forever in an unlicensed mode. So that's where we kind of plug in, as well as the back-end infrastructure, as I showed in my diagram, to generate the actual license, potentially the license files, either within our network or coordinated with some centralized authority. But yes, the end-to-end process, as I showed, is definitely going to be, you know, a multi-vendor ecosystem, and really the management, the broader management functions, you know, have a role to play in that, especially when you look at things like, you know, dynamic scaling, service chain modifications, or service chain mobility from one place to another. You know, there is going to be a role for orchestration, management orchestration platforms to be in a position to control that. So, yeah, that plays very well into what we're seeing, in that the service providers have to take ownership of driving this business environment, and then we as vendors have a role to play, you know, in and around the edges of managing these licenses from an end-to-end perspective. But I don't think we as vendors will be able to own the end-to-end process ourselves, because I can't own it, and 5 other VNF providers also own theirs, and then the service provider has to manage 5 different independent licensing strategies. That'll never work. So yes, I definitely think that's needed, one, and is you know, ultimately going to have to happen over time too, once the kind of the specifications standardized. So.
Thanks,
Okay.
Michael.
Thank you.
Let me just ask you, because there's some more questions are popping up. So specifically about ADVA's experience with various licensing models. So one of the questions is, what in your experience is preferred by operators? One-time, perpetual, recurring, pay-as-you-go, something else?
Yeah, so it's I think it's actually evolving. So for the last several years, as we've been generating you know, quotations to our end customers, you know, they were all built around perpetual licensing models, because it was a lot more simple. It was a one-time transaction, and then everything was kind of done. As we have spent more time building TCO models and actually working with service providers on understanding their business cases, so they've moved out of, hey, I have to, this is more of a technology exercise, to I have to actually build a valid business case to deploy this. They've come back and realized that, you know, I need to manage my cost outlay on the front end of this before I can start generating revenue. So we're now quoting more and more subscription-based models to our end customers, because, you know, it just really affords them more flexibility in terms of, you know, building their business case. So we still do both, but I'm definitely seeing the pendulum swing more towards subscription as we go forward.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Darim, and then again in the audience, you can still submit questions while Darim presents. Let me just change organizers. Wait a minute. Here we go, Darim. The screen is over to you. And again, please all feel free to continue submitting questions. I'm going to try and moderate them as we go along, but just to keep our flow going. And we have 20 more minutes left. Darim, over to you.
Great, thanks Ariella, thanks everybody. Hopefully you can see the screen, the slide background, and you can also hear me.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to jump straight into it. I'm going to basically start talking about some of the licensing options that are being used within the NFV and the networking space, right? And some of the more futuristic views of licensing and how they can how they can help specifically in the NFV space. So I'm going to start off with a slide that has really been covered by a great slide from Michael just a couple of slides back, really. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. This is a global view. This isn't something which is specific to networking by any means, right? This is definitely a global trend within licensing, as there's a shift towards recurring revenue, right? There's a shift away from perpetual-based licensing to subscription, like Michael was talking about. And the ultimate endpoint for this that people are currently viewing is more going towards a usage-based model, right? So it's basically moving away from purchasing components and purchasing software outright to essentially leasing it out on a term or on a subscription basis to the point where the customers are essentially only paying for what they're using, right? So they're not buying quantities of components anymore. They're not buying individual units per se anymore. They're ultimately just simply paying for what they use. There's a trend from here, right, which is going from the capex type expense that Michael was talking about, and there's a shift towards moving these expenses of software, of the components into OpEx, and that's really that's a major factor which is driving this. This most of the industry is following this trend. Some are much further behind than others. The networking space, the NFV world is definitely much further ahead of the pack really here. Michael's already, he was talking about perpetual and subscription. We're talking to some customers, and even subscription is a very futuristic viewpoint for them, right? Compare NFV to something like medical, for example. The medical industry is far behind NFV from a licensing evolution perspective. I'm going to talk about just want to talk one slide about features, about packaging really. Packaging is, Michael talked about, there's a resistance and a from the CSP, from the providers to really adopt licensing in an NFV space and adopt licensing properly from a virtual perspective. And like Michael said, a lot of this is down to the fact that there's still that legacy approach to licensing. There's still, there's still perpetual licenses. There's still unit or item or individual component-based licenses and component-based purchasing, rather than simply buying. Ultimately, you're no longer buying a unit. You're buying a virtual group of units rather. So packaging is a major aspect that really helps here, because I mean there isn't really a licensing technology out there today that doesn't do a fairly decent job of packaging, to be fair, right? So packaging should be something which everybody's embracing ultimately, and if you're not yet, the technology's there to help you do this for sure. The real benefit of packaging from a feature-based licensing perspective, it's not about just simply enabling or licensing into individual features and dividing your product offerings into different versions based upon what licenses are available. I mean, it's also about providing people with, a taster, right? A very short-term license, an add-on module that they may be resisting, right? If you virtualize your appliances, the software ultimately should be it should be available to everyone. It's like Michael said, it's much easier to deploy. It's much easier to get this out to the field. But ultimately, you want people to start, accessing it and using it and testing it. And this is really where packaging really helps, because you can give a base product that a customer subscribed to or customers purchased, and then you can give them a whole load of additional modules just on a week basis or a month basis or ultimately as a trial license. And this is really what, as far as we can see, the packaging is really what's going to help and drive this increase the adoption rates within the NFV space, because it's giving people access to components that they ultimately wouldn't be willing to deploy. Okay, I'm going to shift and just start talking about something which is more specific to a trend within the networking space. So as I showed you on the first slide, we've got this sort of global trend of shift towards recurring revenue. But within each vertical that we have, that we deal with, there's specific attributes, there's specific trends within that vertical, and there's a real trend within the networking space that's fairly consistent across the vertical. The customers are going from the per device model, the purchasing of a fixed number of quantities of devices, right? They're basically mimicking the hardware model, right? They're mimicking the way they used to purchase the hardware devices. That's ultimately what they're looking for, and they just simply want to buy the software, the virtualized versions of these appliances in the same manner, right? So they want to buy a quantity. We want to buy 10 devices or 100 devices or 100 nodes, right? Or 100 users to that device. It's ultimately, it's that machine-based model, right? That is definitely, what Michael referred to as a legacy model, right? That's really where, people are trying to move away from, especially with NFV. So the next real step that we see here is what we call this capacity-based model, right? And this is where people are no longer purchasing a number of devices or a number of nodes, a number of units per se. what they're purchasing is actually the overall capacity of the infrastructure. So whatever the purpose, whatever the value that infrastructure provides, right? Maybe it's encrypting a network, right? Maybe it's processing transactions per second. What's being purchased is the capacity to do that work, right? It could be 5 units, it could be 1,000 units, but ultimately it's what's being licensed or enforced is the amount of bandwidth that specific that specific group of units is capable of processing. Where that ultimately ends up, and also, and you'll see this ultimately in these slides, is that all paths lead to usage. So vendors are seeing usage in the networking space as the ultimate sort of endpoint, just like with all the other verticals that we're dealing with. So if you look at where we see the industry now, the networking vertical at the moment is probably sitting in between the first two boxes. It's somewhere halfway between the per device models and the capacity-based models. We're seeing some vendors, some of our customers in this space are already starting to adopt a usage-based model, but there's really this is really still considered to be the futuristic view. I'm just going to talk about capacity in a bit more detail, really just to kind of sort of explain what this means really. So in a typical scenario, we've got a vendor that's providing a number of nodes, right? They're selling a number of nodes to their customer, to a provider, right? But ultimately what the customer's purchasing is, like I said, is this capacity. So then the number of nodes that's being purchased, it may be something which is enforced, or it may be completely open. They may be allowed to buy an unlimited number of nodes or deploy an unlimited number of nodes. But ultimately, it's the shared capacity that this entire infrastructure is capable of doing that is being enforced, right? So it doesn't really matter how many nodes are deployed. Could be 5, it could be 50, like I said. At some point, the capacity limit that the customers purchase will get reached, and that's ultimately what's being enforced, rather than the number of devices per se. I'm saying devices in a loose manner because we're talking about virtualized devices. So Michael basically said that there's a requirement for customers to be able to scale up and scale down these deployments, right? They want to be able to deploy 20 more devices or 50 more devices as demand goes up and down, right? And this is really why people are licensing capacity as opposed to nodes, because ultimately you don't really care about how many nodes are being deployed anymore. You're ultimately just worried, your concern is on the amount of capacity that's being used. Also talk about usage, because this is, like I said, this is really where we see ultimately everything is heading towards.
And actually, Darren, there are questions. Sorry that I jump in, but there are questions about usage. So it's very good that you continue talking about it, because I'm seeing people ping questions specifically about this. So it's good that you're talking about it. Right. Okay. Great. Yep. So I've got a couple of slides that talk specifically about usage. So maybe this will answer a few of the questions. So the way usage kind of looks in a practical sense is you need a component within the infrastructure that's responsible for gathering the statistics, gathering the data, right? A data engine is typically a service which is within the infrastructure, or it could be hosted out within the public cloud. This component is ultimately responsible for collecting usage information from the individual nodes. The usage, it'll organize this information, it'll aggregate it, and then it'll send this information to our back office environment, our EMS platform, where the reports and the statistics of that usage information can be viewed. So it's really, it's a near to real-time process ultimately. As these nodes, wherever they are across the world, are generating this usage information, they're posting it to this intermediary, the data engine, and that information is then being forwarded on. So it's a very close to real-time view of the usage, the data that's being consumed. There's a lot of benefits to usage ultimately.
And I think the main thing is it's about taking away the concurrency. Ultimately, the vendors are giving the providers the unlimited access to the equipment, to the virtualized equipment. They're giving them no restrictions on the number of seats or the capacity. It's ultimately, the more they use the infrastructure, the more they're going to get charged for it. So this gives them complete freedom on scaling up and scaling down. They don't have to worry about deploying more licenses if they want to scale the infrastructure up. If they want to reduce the size of the infrastructure, they simply scale it down, and the reduced usage patterns will reflect this, right? So it's complete deployment freedom, and this is really where, in the virtualized world, where you have this complete, the whole concept of machines is essentially gone in the virtual world, right? Where people are wanting to scale up and down all the time. This is really where the usage really comes into its own. Another thing that we see again, and like this is we're seeing this as a problem within the NFV space, is the interdependencies. Right? When you turn everything into software, you encourage a licensing interdependency between components. Right? You no longer have a black box communicating with another black box. Right? You can have different software applications all installed on one server, one ultimately off-the-shelf server. Right? If there's a licensing interdependency between these two, or rather a functionality interdependency, you could end up with licensing restrictions on one of these components, blocking the functionality in another component, because maybe it's no longer receiving packets that it was supposed to be receiving because another component has stopped providing them because it's run out of licenses, right? So this whole concept of licensing interdependency is becoming a real problem in NFV. And this is what Jana's question was directly related to this, I think, right? Is people are looking at, was there a way of doing, can we do a universal license enforcement policy, right, that everybody adheres to solve this? And like Michael said, it's really, in the real world, it's not particularly practical. Usage solves this. Usage will completely solve this problem because, again, nobody has a restriction. Everybody can use this stuff as much as they want. It's just the usage data later will reflect what was done. It's not just about billing and pricing. It's just simply about insight, intelligence, right? You can see, how your technology is being used, where it's being used, which regions are using certain functionality more than you may have expected. So the classic BI and analytics aspect comes into it as well. Now, the last point, the ease of use is an important point, because I think usage has been historically seen as a complexity, right? It's been too complex to deploy, too complex to manage for it to be practical. The cost of deploying a usage-based model has been too cost prohibitive, and I think that's really what stopped most vendors from even considering this as a viable option. The technologies are out now to dramatically simplify this. There are services, there's a cloud-based platform. We've totally embraced the cloud and connectivity to provide an effective usage model. And I think that our goal has ultimately been to completely simplify the deployment of a usage model, and ultimately to make it accessible to a far greater audience. I think that's why we really are talking about it these days. I'm not going to talk too much about entitlement management. Michael talked about this in a lot of detail, about the whole back-end infrastructure, the management aspects of licensing. So I'm not going to say too much about this beyond what Michael said. I think the only thing I really want to say is it's a critical part in, I talked about the packaging, and I talked about capacity-based licensing, and of course usage, and these are fairly complex concepts from a licensing perspective. Even packaging can seem to be very complex. If you don't have the right type of automation and the automatic provisioning, right, and the automatic product definition, right, and the whole flows of licensing from the back end to the customer, right? It's so important to kind of do that initial investment to get these components right, because ultimately the reason why most licensing projects fail is because the back office processes are disjointed, or they're error prone, or they're ultimately, you know, they're costing more than the benefit the vendor's getting from licensing. This is a slide just to kind of give some backing to you know, to some of the trends that we've been seeing. Right, we're seeing this out. This is happening in the field as we speak. You know, and if you look at the third row down, where we specifically look at the networking and telco space, right? We've got a lot of customers that are talking and asking and showing us, you know, these models that I'm talking about right now, especially the capacity-based stuff. You know, this is probably the big talking point across pretty much all of these guys that we've got as customers of ours. They're all either talking about it or they've deployed it already. And like I said, usages. Some of these guys, you know, that are on this slide are already starting to deploy usage. Others are really seeing this as their future. But that is the one consistent message, I think, across everybody's viewpoint, is ultimately that usage is really where the expectation is where the industry, all of the industries are going to end up. That's it from me. Last slide. So I just really want to summarize on some of the things that I've talked about. It's all about making sure that you leverage the technology. There's enough technology out there now to make licensing work. And the reason you want to make licensing work is ultimately to increase adoption rates, right? I think we see this in the NFV space as well, right? That there is a resistance to kind of embrace licensing, right? And this is fairly common in any kind of virtualized environment, right? So, but there is technology there to make this work. Absolutely no doubt about that. So it's, you know, the stuff we talked about, find new flexibility, right? Through packaging. So using this concept of feature-based licensing to modularize the functionality, and when you've done that, you can basically provide very short-term test trials and evaluations and test versions of the software, ultimately with almost zero cost from your perspective. The provisioning, from the fulfillment aspects should be automated. They have to be automated to really make this work. Adopt the capacity licensing. This is really where this is a licensing concept that was ultimately born in the networking world. You know, we are seeing it in other areas now. We're seeing it in things like content management, document management space, and stuff like that. But this was really born right in the middle of networking. And then the last point, you know, bring it home again. You know, I keep coming back to this point because we've got all the evidence is telling us that this is where everything is going. You know, is embrace the future of licensing, which is ultimately usage. Use the technology, use the capabilities that exist now that didn't exist 5 years ago even, to make usage a reality. Okay, I think I've probably overrun. I didn't even look at my clock because it's putting me off.
Exactly on the hour. So I was just, again, we're exactly on the hour, Darim. Thank you. And I'll let some people maybe submit questions if they still have, even though we have addressed questions, and I usually try to make this exactly an hour. I'm trying to be conscious of people's time. Before we say goodbye, Michael, is there anything you would like to add? Thank you very much. I thought both sessions were very insightful. Michael, would you like to add anything?
No. I think it was good. I think we both have a kind of a common view of the strategic direction, and so it's all about execution now.
So thank you both, Darim and Michael. Thank you everyone else for joining us today. A recording of this version will be sent to everyone who participated early next week. So thank you again, everyone, and hope to see you again on our next session in next quarter. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.